So I've lost 10,000 years, believe it or not. I'm sitting in this little makeshift recording studio so I can get the echo out, and no word of a lie, it's about 4 by 4, and I got these black drapes and a window in front of me, and I've been recording for about the last 2.5 days, and really nonstop, and essays coming in, and I'm sharing with you this information with you because I want you to understand we're all in the same boat, and I understand the stress that you're undergoing as well. If you ever have an issue, please get in touch with me, and I'll see what I can do. But either way, what had happened, and I was staying up until about 2 o'clock in the night recording material, only to find that my computer, the license was expiring, and there wasn't anything I could do about it because it's a college computer. It prevented the recording, and it wasn't showing me that. So I've been sitting with myself, by myself, in this little 4 by 4 square for 2.5 days, talking to myself. So here we go again. I'm going to tell you everything that I told you the first time around, but the second time around, it's going to be better. You can make sure of that. So ancient civilizations, and when we look at Mesopotamia, this is where we see the emergence of civilization. And here, this is a very specialized word, civilization. It refers to ultimately the fact that we see a centralized authority. So we see a god king, and well, actually, first we start out with a god, and then there's this individual who had to have been really mad clinically, or Namu, because he's the first person to define himself as not only a king, but also a living god on earth. Now that's pretty delusional, I think. Anyhow, so we have centralized authority, we have a god king that emerges, and something that we refer to as social stratification or ranking. And we live in a stratified society. We live in a rank society. So this is one that's marked by inequality. Either way, what we're going to see is here in Mesopotamia, for the very first time in history, they have surplus. And that ultimately leads to new divisions of labor. So we're going to say divisions of labor. That, well, not divisions of divisions. I'm not sure that we could do that. Divisions of labor. And that leads to further specializations. So here with these divisions of labor, and this is laborious getting this word labor to right, divisions of labor, eventually we see the emergence of full-time medicine. And earlier societies, as I've pointed out, they didn't have full-time healers. And that's because they lived in egalitarian. Egalitarian societies, those are societies that are based upon equality, and everybody pretty much does the same thing. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. And before I say any more, I'm going to check my mic this time. Even though I see a green light, I'm going to double check. Playback. Okay, so I'm here because, yeah, it's recording finally, and I guess that expired license, and when the college got on top of it and fixed it for me, that solved the problem, so good thing. We can continue with Mesopotamia. Here we're looking at Mesopotamia, which means the land between two rivers. And there's two groups of individuals discussed in our textbook. On the western side, we have the Natufians, and for example, they're located, some of their sites we find in modern-day Turkey, Katahoyuk, and on the other side, in the Zagros Mountains, so the Zagros Mountains, at a site called Al-Kosh. We've got a group of it, and I'm going to put a little red dot there. Let's make it look the same as the other side. So in the Zagros Mountains, we have a group of people called the Urbadians. The Urbadians. right there. And both of these societies, they're egalitarian and they've settled in an area that we refer to as the hilly flanks. I'm going to outline that in red. So the hilly flanks, just think of a mountainous region above the Tigris and Euphrates River. So it's kind of up and around here and all the way down. And this is where people have settled just prior to the Younger Dryas. That Younger Dryas comes along, and as we've already pointed out, it forces individuals down from these mountainous regions into the valleys in search of water. And that's where we start to find the first civilizations, and in fact, Urbad and Ur-Ak, they're all down here. People are settling around the river because they're utilizing water. So this is the Fertile Crescent, and it is the birthplace of civilization. Now, this doesn't mean that other civilizations didn't emerge. They emerged at other times. They were under the same pressures, the same stressors, and eventually civilizations emerge around the world, and farming is invented 7 different times, 7 different places, but Mesopotamia was the first to develop this. Now, what we're going to see here is a number of different Mesopotamians. So when we talk about Mesopotamia, what's happened are these groups that we've referred to, the Natufians and the Urbadians, they move down and eventually they form the very first civilizations and the first group of people that we refer to as the Sumerians. So that's the first kind of ethnic group to occupy Mesopotamia, and eventually we get the Akkadians and the Babylonians, and there's lots of strife going on here in Mesopotamia. Let's move along. So as pointed out, civilization, it initially develops out of earlier egalitarian villages, and then eventually towns, they start to emerge, and then eventually cities. And as pointed out, the earliest groups, they were egalitarian. How do we know that? Well, here on this image, we see, for example, the oldest continually inhabited city, town on the face of this earth, Jericho. And there's a really long history here. And some of the things that we see, at least archaeologists, they dig up, as we know, artifacts, and one of the things that they're interested in are the grave goods that are buried alongside of individual, because it does tell us about ranking in society, the rank of individuals. What I want you to think about it, if you looked at say a modern, I'm going to go just above civilization where I have a little bit of space because some stuff's going to come up there under the origins. If we look at a modern cemetery, for example, we see different types of headstones. We see some small ones. We see large ones. In fact, this one's so large I can't even get it on the screen. That's okay. And then sometimes we just see little markers. And if we dug up, and please don't go to any cemeteries and dig up to see whether or not you can prove my hypothesis. But if you looked underneath the ground and you excavated, I think you'd find more expensive caskets, and some of them probably with those larger headstones, and maybe very basic ones here. We might even find jewelry and whatnot with some of these individuals. And that illustrates that some people have more money to put into the ground with their loved ones when they are deceased. In contrast, if we look at, for example, a grave site, and military graves are often like this, where we see absolutely no difference between, say, markers or headstones. What that tells us is we're looking at a system where there is equality versus a system with no equality or stratification. When we look at a place like Jericho, we see it goes through this progression where it starts off with everything, all the grave goods that we find are pretty much the same. And that tells us that everybody has the same rank, equality. As we progress through time, we start to see differences. And ultimately that could be translated into the resources that people had to put into the ground because they had more resources during the time of their life. So we're seeing things change over time. Now, as for the emergence of civilization, people have relocated in search of regular sources of water. They've come down from the hilly flanks and in the Fertile Crescent, and they begin to dig irrigation ditches, and they begin to invent farming. So villages, they're beginning to expand, get larger around 6,000 years before the present. And as pointed out, the very first group of people in Mesopotamia are the Sumerians. So we start off with sedentary groups of people, and that's the way it's emerging. They're sedentary, they're living in one place, sedentary groups of people. They're initially egalitarian, and over time, stratification begins to emerge. Some people just have greater access, or their associations to people like, and I pointed out Ur-Nammu. Well, if you're Ur-Nammu's brother-in-law, you're going to have access to more resources than somebody who is not Ur-Nammu's brother-in-law. Eventually, specialized labor begins to develop, and I'm going to go through this and show you a model, because for the first time in history, with the emergence of civilization, and earlier egalitarian societies as well, people have surplus. And that causes new types of labor, specialized labor, and eventually the specializations that we see in medicine. So civilization, we see specialized labor. I'll go to my highlighter here just so we have this and we know what we're looking at. We're looking at stratified societies. They're sedentary, living in one place. We see specialized labor. That's another characteristic. And a central authority. Let's move to the next slide. So let's get a definition up here. And I've said that Mesopotamia, it means the land between two rivers. And in fact, it's a Greek word. Meso, which means middle. So the land between two rivers. And the rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And as pointed out, when we talk about Mesopotamians, we're not referring to one single group, but rather a number of individuals who occupied this region. So I'm going to lay out some of the individuals that we're interested in looking at here, or at least the civilizations. The Sumerians, we're interested in them right up at the top. They're the first individuals to invent writing. So we'll talk a little bit about writing, the role of writing in medicine. With them, we enter the historical period, and we get that notable ruler Gilgamesh and the Epic of Gilgamesh. As we move down a little bit further in here, I want to go to Ur-Nammu. This is the first individual to call himself not just a king, there's a shift. He defines himself as a god king. And what this causes is a shift in the political structure of the society. They move to what's called a theocracy. And that's pretty important because that places very significant limits on what can take place in this society, or any society that's run by a god king. We'll talk a little bit about the old Babylonians. We have Hammurabi, for example, and he is responsible. I'll just put some arrows here because it looks better. He's responsible for the first code of ethics, and especially in medicine. And you might not think that, from if you've ever been to Paris, the Louvre, you've seen the Code of Hammurabi, this large black monolithic structure with all this writing on it. Hammurabi means the kinsman who heals. And that makes sense. If he's in a theocracy, he is a god king, and he has power over healing. So this is very much, I'm going to write this on the side, personalistic. Personalistic model. We're not going to just associate that with traditional cultures. We find a lot of similarities in the reliance upon supernaturalism, for example. that supernaturalism here. Now, that doesn't mean that individuals, as we've discussed, don't rely upon techniques, new medical developments, new techniques, but the idea is the personalistic features or characteristics of their worldview are always performed alongside of, say, a surgery or an attempt to deal with a wound. The last individual here I want to point out is an individual by name of Ashurbanipal. And Ashurbanipal has and it sounds silly, he's got a library. It's hard to come across libraries with books nowadays, but Ashurbanipal, he has a library with books. Not the books that we have, but tablets, and maybe not the tablets that we have. He's got clay tablets, lots and lots of clay tablets. But this is the largest collection of medicine that exists at this point of time. And because that was collected, we're able to look back and understand the Mesopotamians. Let's move along. So eventually the Urbadians come down from the mountains and they establish Ur and Uruk, and eventually Sumer. And Sumer is perhaps a little more original than Ur and Uruk. Either way, this is the first city-state, and it's emerged in Sumer around 4000 BCE or 6,000 years ago and developed by the Urbadians. What begins to take place at this time, as I've pointed out, is that stratification. And with the stratification, medicine begins to change. So the earlier societies, as pointed out, if they were egalitarian, if they're egalitarian, medicine is a part-time occupation. There's no full-time jobs. Hey, I'm a healer. Oh, okay. Somebody in the past would say, I'm a shaman. Well, hey, so too am I. I have healing powers as well. The kung, for example, and sorry if that popped your ear, go up here, kung, they believe that everybody has the power to heal. They can boil their energy. It's just that some people do it better. And they're a great example of an egalitarian society. As we shift to a ranked society, what begins to emerge are full-time healers. We're going to take a look at how that happens. Let's just go through a few of these civilizations. So in fact, PowerPoint tells me we're going to do something different. We're going to talk about stratification and surplus. Now, as pointed out, this is the first time this has happened. If we looked at foraging societies, they didn't have surplus. That wasn't part of their culture. Surplus is only associated with cultivating societies. Okay, so with the invention of farming. Now, what ends up happening here with surplus? And if we think of this question that I have in the right-hand corner, what types of basic occupations do you think are necessary if you have surplus? I'll give you a second and then I'll start writing it out here. What do you think? You've got surplus. What do you need to do with that extra stuff? For example, here's the Mesopotamian symbol for grain. Yeah, like that. What are you going to do with it? Well, if you got a lot of it, you got to put it into something. So somewhere to store our resources. So the very first type of occupation that begins to emerge, not the first, but alongside of a series of them, is potters. Not in the sense that, I don't know, we might be thinking of potters today. They're doing something a little bit different. In addition to that grain, we need individuals to collect it or harvest. We need individuals who are responsible for tilling the fields. The other thing that happens, so we're collecting, we're planting, we're tilling, we're ensuring that our irrigation ditches are nice and clean. We got to protect this stuff, don't we? If you've got extra cash in your pocket, you just want to toss it around and leave it there in case somebody breaks into your house. No, you're going to hide it underneath of the mattress. They're going to do the same thing, except they're going to have a military. And within that military, eventually, the best fighter, perhaps, or the most respected fighter, the general, emerges as a king. And we're starting to get stratification taking place here. If we've got a military, we've got to ensure that they're healthy, right? So here's where medicine begins to emerge. In addition to the medicine or healing soldiers who have been wounded, we also have animals associated, so we start to get veterinarian medicine as well. Other things, the military, they need weapons. The people who are tilling the fields, they need hoes. So the trades, a hoe, this is a hoe. It's a stick, Neolithic tool. And on the bottom, you've got a little rock shaped like this that you can use to dig the field. That's a hoe. Okay, so stratification, we're getting all kinds of new occupations. We're starting to get specialization. As society becomes more complex, people can't do everything for themselves. So here, surplus and leadership, it plays a role in creating this social stratification. Here I've got a short form, strata. Highly specialized occupations, they eventually emerge, and people were ranked on the basis of their occupation. So we see examples of this, for example, we don't want to say for example too often. In the caste system, for example, India, for instance, let's switch that up a little bit, starting to get a little stale here tonight. In the caste system, individuals are ranked on the basis of their occupation. So, for example, individuals such as teachers, teachers are ranked pretty high, and then we move down through other occupations. College teachers are probably not ranked that high. Anyhow, we get a ranking system based upon our occupation. If you're a teacher, you'd have more status. If you're military, you'd have more status, and on and on. So the caste system is also a very early type of system. In India, it was banned apparently in the 1950s, 1953 and around there, but it still does exist to some extent, a very ancient way of organizing people in society. And, that's what's happening. It's about organization. People can't do whatever they want because nothing's going to get done. We need to organize that. All right, so now we know how surplus has led to stratification in society and medicine. It also fits into this. Let's move along. The other thing about Sumer and the Sumerians is they're responsible for inventing writing, and with them, the historical period begins. Prehistory is finished at this point of time. And what they invent is something called cuneiform. Cuneiform is a type of writing that's used to keep, good thing to remember here, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, economic records. And that's the way writing begins. As pointed out, one of the main concerns is associated with surplus. And as surplus is tied to rank, and some people have more surplus, some people have less surplus, people start to borrow. And you want to know, for example, if you're Ashurbanipal, keep track of how many goats Hammurabi had borrowed from you. So you write it down. And that's what they did. Eventually it transforms from a system that's used to keep economic transactions to a system that's used to tell stories. And here there's a message, there's a story. The Sumerians are using what's referred to as cuneiform, kind of icon that's used, or a graphic. This, for example, means wheat. This symbol, an ancient Sumerian, means God or the heavens. And eventually it becomes more stylized. For example, we see something like this, right? And then it transforms eventually into this one, blow your mind, into that for God or the heavens. And then eventually it just becomes An, once the Phoenician alphabet is invented and adopted. Other things you might see, and it is a very simple way of writing. What's that look like? It looks like mountains. And in front of the mountains, if we were Bob Ross here, we'd put some little waves, happy little waves. And in those happy little waves, we put a little happy little duck, a happy little bird there. And maybe while we're looking at that happy little bird, we might have something to drink. That's a symbol for drink. And if we felt like it, we might add a bowl to that and eat. Okay, enough of that silliness. Let's translate what's going on here. So what I see, you know what? I'm going to use black. Black works a little bit better on this one. So what I see here is a piece of wheat, a piece of grain, right there, the very first panel. And I see a duck or a bird. Not sure what the species is. Something, something, a little more wheat over here. And you get the other wonderful invention of the Sumerians. Oh, if you're thinking beer, you know it, don't you? They invented beer. So some experts think that this first couple of panels, these 4 panels, are talking about a recipe. And then it begins to change. Then we see, for example, over here, an individual drinking. And 1, 2 beers. This is many beers. This is drink many beers. And now you see a little horse, an animal. And then move over to something, something, something over here up top. And at the side, the gods or the heavens. I think this says drink many beers, act crazy like a pig, and see the heavens. There's probably some hallucinogenic, no, in all honesty, there's probably hallucinogenic substances in this as well, maybe produced from mold or whatever fermentation process is going on there. There was a lot of different things in their beer, and it didn't taste like, for example, Nickelbrook. Not even close to that nice hoppy beer that they have there. It's probably more like prune juice, wine, beer, maybe a little bit of whiskey. Probably fairly revolting. Anyhow, drink many beers, act crazy like a pig, see the gods and something, something, and get what? Right over here, look at it. A bowl. And get the munchies. Right, he's over here, he's eating. This is great. It's telling us to sit back and relax a little bit once in a while. A message from the ancient Sumerians. With that said, sit back and relax. Maybe pause for a little bit. We're going to move on to the next slide. I'll see you over there. So eventually we get that transition from economic record keeping, right? And eventually we start to see histories and stories begin to emerge. And finally, medicine and medical conditions are recorded. For example, here in the Tablet of Nippur, they discuss a condition wherein an individual, when they breathe, it sounds a whole lot like there's a flute stuck in their throat, they say, and that's very characteristic of tuberculosis. So the Tablet of Nippur, it is the oldest medical textbook. I'm going to highlight there, right at the bottom, the oldest medical textbook in existence. Let's move along. So I'm going to take you back a second here to surplus. And with surplus, I said we got some trades. General tradespeople begin to emerge. We have work associated with farming. And we could continue, but I'm going to stop right there. Within each one of these areas, we start to see further specializations. Right? Individuals that would be responsible for tilling the fields, individuals that would harvest, individuals that would, we got collecting, harvest, process. And with the trades, perhaps pottery, stuff to do with homes, weapons, tools, on and on and on. So we're seeing a lot of specialization. The same thing is true with medicine. Medicine, you'd have veterinarian medicine, you'd have medicine that would deal with basic injuries, especially with war and warfare. You'd have individuals that were responsible for healing people in general on a religious level. So three types of full-time medical occupations. Number one, the baru. And this is type of a prophetic healer or a prophet. So very religious, ritually pure, probably doesn't come into contact with a lot of individuals. A high priest, imagine that. An asu is kind of a general practitioner. Okay, a general practitioner, and they're most likely employed by the state. They're a priest, physician. So we have the religious element, and of course we have the technical element. And then we move down to the ashipu priests, which probably are best described as kind of street magicians. Not Chris Angel. I know what you're thinking. Chris Angel, really? No. Street magician, individuals who are involved in supernatural healing, rituals, probably selling some snake oil as well and whatnot. But this is the lowest class of healers in Mesopotamian society. So we've got a series of takeovers, and I'm not going to go into everything. We have Sumerians, and they fall to the Akkadians, and they eventually fall to the Babylonians. And here, the old Babylonians, we find the great king Hammurabi. So the Babylonians, they've conquered the Akkadians, and King Hammurabi, I'm going to highlight him. We should definitely remember him for the test. Yeah, where's that highlighter? There we go. Hammurabi. He receives a code. I'm going to point out here along with that Hammurabi means kinsman who heals. Okay, so that connection between the king, okay, he's a king, he's a god, and he is also a healer. It's been established, and it is in fact a tradition that continues through time. Even when we get to ancient Greece, for example, the gods, they're healers. Apollo, for example. All of those connections are there. So King Hammurabi, he receives a code, and in that code, we find the very first code of ethics. What's kind of important about this code of Hammurabi is, it is the earliest code of ethics. A lot of people think that Hippocrates, his Hippocratic Oath, is the oldest. It isn't. The Code of Hammurabi is, in fact, the oldest. And with this, the other important element, it shows us that by 1770 to the 1750s, there is a formal medical tradition that's been established in Mesopotamia. So this is the first Code of Ethics, and it illustrates that medicine has become legislated or ruled by the government. Now, this is important because this is a theocratic society. In other words, and we've said this, it's not just a king, it's a god king or a king god, probably god they'd prefer first. That's okay. We have a king god, a god king, and they're in charge of, well, health and healing. Now, one of the questions I pose and tackled in the textbook is it possible to move away from personalistic disease theories to naturalistic in a theocratic society? What do you think? Because ultimately this would involve a person, a physician, denying the power of a god king, saying, well, imagine to Hammurabi, you say, you play no role in healing or health, which is ultimately a denial of power, right? You're taking away power from that god king in that theocratic society, and you're not going to get away with it because some of the punishments that we do find in these texts are very draconian. an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for messing up a surgery, that type of stuff. So if you're going to challenge the God in this society, the living God, and say he has no power, I wouldn't be surprised if you got your head lopped off. So what does Hammurabi say about medicine in this godly code that he's received? I say godly code because it is in fact something that was given to him from the gods in the same way that the Old Testament, which is much later than the Code of Hammurabi. Code of Hammurabi comes first. The gods give Hammurabi a code in much in the same way that God gave the Ten Commandments to Moses. And here we have that connection. I just want to point out, back to Ur-Nammu. For whatever reason, he thought he was a god, a little delusional. He said, I am a god, I am a deity, and I am a king. The same thing is true now of Hammurabi. Anybody who falls into this lineage. Now, within this code, Hammurabi, he lays out appropriate medical fees. He's thinking about this in a logical manner. He says some people have got a lot of cash, and well, when it comes to paying for medicine, they're going to pay as well. But when it comes to individuals that really don't have much money, we shouldn't charge them a lot. We should be fair about that. The health of everyone is important because that's about the state, the Babylonian state in this type of condition. So he lays out what's appropriate for a cured free man and what's appropriate for curing a slave, which at that point of time they did exist in the society, and they were ultimately a resource. Something an individual owned, and there were appropriate fees to keep that property up to date, as terrible as it sounds. There were also fines for incompetence and failure. So, for example, if your surgery ended in the death of that resource, that slave, okay, you'd owe a slave. It was just that simple, according to Hammurabi. And if you didn't want to pay, well, you're going to face further punishment, which might in fact result in death or the loss of a hand. If you're doing cataract surgery on somebody and they lose their eye, so we could say eye loss, you're going to lose your eye as well. Okay, so that type of failure, we're going to see eye loss. You're going to lose your eye. Okay, let's move on. And then we come to the library of Ashurbanipal with the Assyrians. And as pointed out, here we have absolutely hundreds and hundreds of books on medicine. And what's interesting about this is it illustrates that medicine, by and large, doesn't change over thousands of years. So medicine does not change much over thousands of years, and we know why. Just going to reflect on this for a second. Why? It's a theocratic society. So Egypt, and I'm going to point this out, it's going to be the same because Egypt is a theocratic society. We're not going to see any changes, even though these people are very smart, and the Egyptians, they're brilliant. And I think if, the Mesopotamians were great, which they were, and if we think about the Egyptians, they probably came up with a phrase, whatever the Mesopotamians did, we can do better. And they did. Either way, the Egyptians, they're also a theocratic society. It's not until Greece that democracy emerges. So don't expect to see any really significant changes in medicine until the emergence of democracy. The great late Roy Porter says Mesopotamian medicine is best defined as sorcery, systematized. What the heck does that mean? Well, he means they are really good at being consistent. With supernaturalism. That's all. Why is that? How's that? How's that at all possible? Well, They're really good at being consistent. Do a little arrow over here because they've got, I'm going to put quotation marks around it, they've got books. And they follow the rules that have been laid out. And nobody challenges. So, do they challenge the rules and what's said in the book? Absolutely not, because that would involve experiment. And we know what the cost is. You know, if I'm going to 2 arrows up here, if it goes well, that's a great thing. You know, you might be seen as a hero in medicine. However, if it doesn't go well, if it runs amok, man, what does Hammurabi say? Let's draw a hand there. That's been severed. Make it a little bit bloody in there and whatnot. That's your hand. You know, that's what's happened to your arm. Hammurabi has decided to take it off because your medical practices have hurt somebody, you've run amok. So within the system, as I've pointed out, we're not going to see a lot of changes because of the limits that, and I've written this 3 or 4 times. This is a nudge, nudge, wink, wink, hint, hint. You better get at that theocracy. That theocratic system is playing a significant role in limiting the development of medicine. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because we know about traditional theories, and it's not going to change from the traditional cultures that we've looked at. In Mesopotamia, disease, it's a result of moral offenses, it's a result of religious offenses, and perhaps crime. So here, this votive, okay, that we're seeing on the other side, which is an offering. It says, what am I to do with a child with 6 toes? Well, the guy's probably thinking, what did I do to get a child with six toes? I engaged in some kind of a moral offense, a religious offense, or some type of a crime. So that's the general logic. And what I want to point out is it is logical. Right? Some people say that this medicine is irrational, this type of system. No, it's not. Because if you believe in supernaturalism, and that's, you know, your world view, that everything's ordered in a supernatural way, it wouldn't make sense to move away from a supernatural type of effect. So we've got that cause and we effect, and the way that we cause change in a supernatural world is through further supernaturalism. What would be illogical is if you believed in a supernatural worldview and you engaged in science. That don't make sense. That's a contradiction. The other one isn't a contradiction. So healing here, it consists of everything that's going to make sense. It's going to consist of exorcism, magic and incantation, hepatoscopy, which is examining a liver, also horoscopy, so examining organs, as our textbook points out, to foretell the future or identify illness. In Sangoma, we saw this. Among the Zulu, they engaged in that horoscopy and that sympathetic magic. And just so you know, the Farmer's Almanac, it's also based on horoscopy. Drek Apothecary, this one's kind of gross. Drek, it's poop. So these are medicines and applications that are based upon applying excretia to an individual. Pretty nasty stuff. So as for the diseases that exist in Mesopotamia, a few examples our textbook talks about: dental attrition. And here we don't have sterile environments. There's sand, there's all kinds of stuff, and that's getting into people's food. So it's causing their teeth to wear down. Bronchitis, smallpox, that's emerged at this time. Schistosomiasis associated with farming, floodplain irrigation. Tinea infections, meat that just isn't cooked well enough. I like my meat raw, but it doesn't have little tinea larvae in it. Gonorrhea has become a problem, and tuberculosis. Anything more? Let's see. Yeah, cancers, because people are cooking inside with hearths. So we're seeing a lot of lifestyle diseases starting to emerge as well. The other thing that's happened is cities have become dense enough to allow any acute infection to persist. Now, what the heck do I mean by that? Well, let's say we got Society A, Society B. We've talked about this. This is sounding familiar, isn't it? And Society C. Now, let's say Society A gets sick. Well, they're going to circulate that disease among themselves. But so long as they can't reach Society B, the illness is going to stop with them. Once these groups begin to increase in size and we start to get trade between them, regular contact, maybe little urban centers and suburbs, and everyone becomes interconnected, look at what happens to disease. It just continues to circulate among individuals, moving from one person to the next person. And you know what? I can't do this all at the same time. More people are being born. And as more people are born, it continues to circulate through this society. There's always a fresh new host to infect, and it continues to move like this. And it really doesn't stop until every dry piece of wood is burned. And that'll be the same for COVID unless we come up with a vaccine. It's just going to keep on moving and moving and moving. So diseases associate with the environment. They have merged. Animals, because they're keeping animals. And of course, poor hygiene. You're thinking, poor hygiene? Yeah. You know what? Where's well, in Canada we say washroom. The United States they say restroom. Where's the washroom? Where's the restroom? Well, they had ancient latrines, areas that you, I'll draw something over here, an area, maybe a walled area where people went to pee and they went to poo, maybe covered up a little bit. So you'd walk in here where people were doing their business, and you'd do your business and you'd walk out. Oh, but they had an area, a little cistern where you could wash your feet with the dirty water that everybody else has washed their poopy feet into. And yeah, now I'm clean. No, you're not clean. You're dirtier. That's all. So these were filthy, dirty civilizations. The only thing that worked in their advantage is a lot of it was outside, and UV radiation, sunlight, it does some awesome work to germs. That beats down, continues to beat down, and it kills germs. So, it's kind of a trade-off. You'd walk in here and hopefully your feet weren't too dirty. You let them get a little bit of a suntan, and then maybe it'd be all right after that. One of my professors in grad school, he said, if I ever have to have a surgery, in his deep voice, if I ever have to have surgery, I want to have it outside on a tennis field. It's the safest place. Yeah, I know. I get a little bit weird after reading too much. No, he was a great guy. Great guy, Dave Stymist. So one of the diseases that I want to talk about is tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, it's caused by let's put an I in there, a bacterium. And the bacterium, I'm going to go over with my highlighter to the other side, to the first one. It should be here. It's the second one. I know you're saying that's the second one, but it is the first one. It emerges first. Mycobacterium bovinus. And if you're familiar with animals, bovid, that's cattle. Cattle are bovid. So this comes from cattle. So individuals who first handled milk, and it wasn't pasteurized milk, okay? They didn't drink it. At this point in time, we don't start drinking milk until at least somewhere around probably 6,500 years ago. Raw milk just would have destroyed our systems. It's toxic to adults if you have lactose intolerance. They would have made yogurt from it, unpasteurized, and the other thing they made from it earlier was cheese, and these are ways of reducing the lactose in milk. But if it was infected with bovinus, Well, and now you've picked up Mycobacterium bovinus, which would have led to tuberculosis. Eventually that mutates and we get the human variant of Mycobacterium bovinus, which is transmitted between humans, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And there's also another species referred to as Mycobacterium africanus. Okay, so the origin of this, we said bovids, or the other word for cattle. There may have been an earlier species, we're not entirely sure. As for morbidity, how many individuals are currently infected with tuberculosis? Probably about half of the globe. A lot of people have TB. And the interesting thing is, TB isn't highly infectious. When it comes to active tuberculosis, only 10% of the people around the world that have TB have what's referred to as active tuberculosis, and that's the one that's infectious. And even though it is infectious, it's not terribly infectious. You need somebody coughing sputum at you. So again, and we've talked about how culture contributes to the spread of disease, and even though tuberculosis isn't terribly infectious, well, now if we add in cultural factors and human behavior, it's going to increase the odds or the chances of contracting this, and depending upon the situation and if it's ideal for transmitting that particular infection. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Last slide, and then I'm done for the evening. The Plague of Philistines at Ashdod. This is a painting from the 1600s, but it's caused historians of medicine to speculate and inquire into, well, what disease is discussed here? Because somebody must have recorded this. People just don't. Historically, they recorded actual events, so we assume that this event did take place. If you're not familiar with it, the Philistines stole the Ark of the Covenant from Judaic people, and after they stole that Ark of the Covenant, they came down with a disease that was characterized by emerods. And they said these emerods were in their secret or their private places. We can translate that secret to private places. What private places? Well, what's private? Well, genitals. That would be private. Other private things, anus. That's another private thing. We also need to think of these are old times, and all cultures back then, and generally people think that Islam is always been just a culture of modesty. Christianity was a culture of modesty at one point of time. The same type of clothing was worn, except for the ancient Romans and whatnot. They dressed like this guy over here, just with a toga, walking the streets. This is pretty graphic here. Either way, genitals, anus, cultures of modesty. You don't walk into a church or a temple and show your armpits or your neck. Those are sensitive areas that are respected and covered up. Okay, so emerods. What are emerods? Emerods are bumps. And one of the earliest kind of translations of this, or ways to understand it, they say emerods in private places. Emerods in private places, like the anus. Emerods in, no, and seriously, you think I'm joking. I'm not. They said maybe this was an epidemic of hemorrhoids. No, it's not. That would be a cruel god. An epidemic of hemorrhoids, no. The bumps, private places, we need to be cautious about that. They weren't referring to the anus, even though that is a private place. They were probably referring to the neck, genitals, or the secret places, armpits. You're putting it together. You're starting to get what's in all of these areas. Lymph nodes, What affects lymph nodes? Bubonic plague. So this is, we think, the very first outbreak or recorded outbreak of bubonic plague, and it would make sense in city centers. What ends up happening with bubonic plague is it's a disease that's carried by rats, and the rats die off, and the fleas that live on those rats, they don't have anything to eat or drink anymore, no more blood. So the female, they go and they suck the blood of a human. And as if sucking blood isn't enough, it's kind of like mosquitoes. They leave a little bit of anticoagulant in there, and that makes it itchy. With the fleas, they regurgitate. And if they have the bacterium that's responsible for bubonic plague, they regurgitate it into you. And then, a number of days later, you get these buboes or these bumps start to blacken and get purple. And eventually they open up and pus oozes out and you die. Horrible. Horrible stuff. The other thing that goes along with this to give us, again, that insight, and I had pointed out rats. So you're seeing a lot of rats die during bubonic plague or just before it. There was a gift. Not only did they give that Ark of Covenant back and said, hey, we don't want it. Please take it back. They gave them a gift. Golden rodents. Which kind of give us that circumstantial evidence that they did recognize that something was up with the rats at that point of time as well. Okay, we're going to leave it here. We're going to pick up with Mesopotamia. Take care. You can hear my dog in the background, can't you? She's been barking all day. Take care.